Scores move minds. Quotes, they move rooms. When you're evaluating any sort of market research like the Elevate report, it's important that you keep in mind that you have qualitative research and quantitative research. Most market research that's out there is quantitative in nature, the numbers, right? How many organizations think you did a good job? But in reality, what you want to understand is what's underneath it. If you don't have the qualitative statements, what are you going to give to leadership? They don't want to see another chart. Real change is driven through qualitative statements. Since the beginning, over 11 years ago, we've always done quantitative and qualitative research. Each year, we get about 150 different patient advocacy organizations to engage in our quantitative, the numbers driven side of our report, and about a quarter of those participate in a follow up interview. That's where we're able to get them on the phone, ask questions, understand their responses deeper, and take them on that journey of what that partnership looked like. What were you able to do together that actually was meaningful to the patient community? And why do you think other organizations should do the same? That's where the real change happens. That's the insights that it doesn't matter how many charts and graphs you have of being first place. It's those types of statements that make the moves that you need as a leader in patient advocacy. We all know that in most organizations, patient advocacy is come to when we need someone to speak to the company for a national meeting or for a feel good Friday. But if you're like me, which I'm sure you are, as an advocacy leader, you know that advocacy means more than that. You know that patient voice needs to be driven into the DNA of your organization. What better way to do that than with the actual verbatim statements of what's been said about your company, its leadership, your advocacy function, all of the things that you are doing as an advocacy function? That's where, again, the rubber hits the road. And we're able to not only address issues with budgets and internal systems and processes. Believe me, one quote can make more moves than countless emails of charts and feedback that you've been sending for months on end. To give you an example, one very large, let's call them a top five pharmaceutical company based out of New Jersey, surprise, surprise, had been trying to change their grant process for a number of years. We're talking over 3 years. That wonderful process run by compliance, in which a patient advocacy organization, a nonprofit that's serving the patients, wants to be able to get access to funds. Many companies have a grant portal that these individuals are sent to apply for a grant. The problem is that these grant portals can be cumbersome, burdensome, require a lot of different documentation, rules, regulations, follow up periods, follow up interviews, you name it. It can be very onerous to get access to, let's say, $20,000 for the year. We're not talking crazy amounts of money. And don't get me wrong, it could be up to six figures. But this particular organization had been hearing for years about how difficult their grant portal was to utilize. And no matter how many times they complained, no matter how many times they got quantitative feedback and brought those numbers to their compliance teams, it never made a difference. It wasn't enough to move the needle. One report of the Elevate report, one statement in which it claimed that this particular organization does most things right, except for their grant portal, which is absolutely atrocious. And I wish that they would make changes to it, because you know what? I, as an advocate, have been providing that feedback for years, but they just don't do it. That one statement alone made all the difference. It made those 3 years, 4 years of attempts go right out the window, and change was being identified, and opportunities to make that grant process more orderly and easier were already getting underway. All of those years of fighting internally with quantitative charts about how poor the grant portal was, we're now over. That one statement alone from one organization that gave the context of their use of it, the amount of times they provided feedback on it, and their continued struggle with it, that one quantitative statement was enough for the compliance team to finally break down and make the change that everyone had been saying was needed for years. That's the power of quantitative research. Yes, don't get me wrong. Quantitative research is important. It's important to have numbers. It's important to have appropriate ends. It's appropriate to have the right size sample. But without the qualitative, we're not going to move the mountains that we need to move in patient advocacy. Another example for you comes out of the med tech space, med device. This was a large med device organization in the diabetes space who, unfortunately, internally, their own leaders felt that the team was no better than a glorified happy hour team, meaning they showed up to all the fun conferences and events and held happy hours. And the internal perception was that's all that team was good for. It was the qualitative as well as the quantitative data that showed that this team was not only the best in the medical device space within that diabetes domain, but they were also one of the top two across all organizations in the diabetes space. That quantitative was strong, but even better were the statements, the qualitative research that went with it. The comments about how we couldn't have gotten X, Y, and Z done if it wasn't for this individual, one of their team members on the advocacy function. Or without this team member, we wouldn't have addressed this health equity issue for our patient population. Or I would have stopped working with this company X amount of years ago if it weren't for that person. It pointed to not only the importance of the team, but the depth of the relationship, how much the organization's corporate reputation hinged on this team, and that this was not just a glorified happy hour team, but rather an integral part to the organization. So, again, I challenge you when you're thinking about market research to assess the impact of your patient advocacy function and how you're viewed by your customers, do you have the qualitative elements to really drive the needle? Or are you still just focusing on quantitative? Let us help you make that change.